In the pre-dawn hours of that sweltering June morning in 1944, specifically the 19th day of the month, the clock had just struck 4 when a Japanese naval officer found himself grappling with thoughts that could have cost him his life. Lieutenant Commander Yoshiaki Irikin stood on the flight deck of the Shokaku, one of the carriers serving as the flagship for Carrier Division 3, positioned somewhere in the vast expanse of the Philippine Sea. His hands wouldn't stop shaking as he reached up to adjust the flight goggles that sat against his forehead, and in those trembling movements lay the physical manifestation of a terrible realization that had been dawning on him over the past several hours of observation and contemplation. The words he scribbled into his personal log that morning would have warranted immediate execution had any of his superiors discovered them, yet he felt compelled to record what he had witnessed, what he had come to understand about the enemy they were about to engage. The Americans, he wrote with careful strokes despite his trembling hands, possessed something that went far beyond mere numerical superiority in planes or ships. What they had developed was an entirely different conception of how modern warfare should be conducted, an approach that seemed to operate according to principles that the Japanese command had never fully grasped or perhaps had willfully ignored. Every fibre of his being told him that they were about to fly into their own deaths, and the knowledge weighed on him like an anchor dragging him down into dark water. As he peered through the darkness that still blanketed the ocean before the sun would rise, Irikin had observed things that contradicted everything that 3 solid years of victories had taught the Imperial Japanese Navy. Those victories, stretching from Pearl Harbor through the Indian Ocean and beyond, had created a narrative of Japanese invincibility that was now crumbling before his eyes as he studied the intelligence reports and radar signatures that told a very different story. The American radar systems were painting their aircraft across multiple screens at distances that seemed almost impossible, tracking Japanese planes at ranges their own equipment couldn't even dream of matching. It was as if the Americans could see through the darkness and distance with an almost supernatural clarity. What struck him as particularly ominous was the way the American vessels conducted themselves with such brazen confidence. Electric lights blazed from every single American ship, illuminating the night as if they were conducting peacetime exercises rather than preparing for what both sides knew would be a decisive naval engagement. This wasn't the behavior of a fleet worried about being discovered or attacked. This was the posture of a force that felt so secure in its defensive capabilities that it didn't even bother with basic light discipline. The intercepted radio chatter that Japanese signals intelligence had managed to capture and partially translate revealed yet another disturbing reality. The Americans were employing coordinated fighter direction techniques that made the Japanese communication systems appear positively primitive by comparison. They were talking to their pilots in the air, guiding them to targets, directing them away from danger, orchestrating the entire aerial ballet with a level of coordination that Japanese forces simply couldn't replicate. Across the decks of 9 Japanese carriers spread out across the Philippine Sea that morning, 430 of the Emperor's finest naval aviators were going through their pre-flight preparations, checking their equipment, saying whatever private prayers or thoughts they harbored before climbing into their cockpits.
These men represented a cross-section of Japanese naval aviation at that particular moment in the war. Some were veterans who had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor nearly 3 years earlier, men who had executed the raids across the Indian Ocean that had sent British forces reeling, pilots who had survived the brutal encounters at Coral Sea and other engagements. But interspersed among these experienced warriors were barely trained replacements, young men who had been rushed through abbreviated training programs and had never once fired their weapons in actual combat against enemy aircraft. None of these 430 aviators, neither the veterans nor the novices, had any real conception of what awaited them in the hours ahead. They couldn't have known that within the next 14 hours of that June day, they would bear witness to and become victims of the complete annihilation of Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force. The losses they would sustain would be so catastrophic, so utterly one-sided, that American pilots engaging them would later mockingly refer to the entire engagement as a turkey shoot, the kind of target practice one might conduct at a county fair rather than a major naval battle between two great powers. The mathematics that would govern their destruction had already been calculated, though not in the traditional military metrics of kill ratios or tactical maneuvers that staff officers typically employed when wargaming potential engagements. Instead, the outcome had been predetermined by fundamental disparities in technology, training, and industrial capacity that no amount of courage or fighting spirit could possibly overcome. Consider the radar systems alone. American vessels were equipped with sets capable of tracking targets at distances up to 150 miles, providing warning and tracking information that allowed them to vector their fighters toward incoming threats with devastating precision. The Japanese equipment, by contrast, was barely functional at ranges beyond 50 miles, and even at those shorter distances, the information it provided was often unreliable or incomplete. Then there was the question of pilot training, which represented perhaps the most crucial disparity of all. American aviators arriving in the Pacific Theater in mid-1944 had received approximately 600 hours of flight training before they ever saw combat. This wasn't just time in the cockpit. This was structured instruction that covered everything from basic flight principles to advanced combat tactics, gunnery practice, navigation, instrument flying, and squadron-level coordination. The Japanese aviators, by contrast, were being rushed through programs that provided them with less than 100 hours of total flight time, and much of that time was spent on basic flying skills rather than combat techniques. The gap in experience and capability this created was simply insurmountable. The aircraft themselves told a similar story of technological divergence. The Americans were flying Grumman F-6F Hellcats, purpose-built fighters powered by engines generating 2,000 horsepower. These planes featured armor plating that protected the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks that could take hits without erupting into flames, and robust construction that could absorb punishment and keep flying. The Japanese were still flying Mitsubishi Zeros that, while highly maneuverable, retained essentially the same fragile design philosophy from 1940. They had no armor protection for the pilot, their fuel tanks could be ignited by a single tracer round, and their lightweight construction that gave them their famous agility also meant they could be destroyed by relatively modest damage that a Hellcat would simply shrug off. The seeds of the collapse that would manifest so dramatically on June 19th had actually been planted months earlier, though few officers in the Japanese Naval Command had recognized the trajectory they were on, or perhaps had simply refused to acknowledge it. Following the devastating losses sustained at Midway, in the grinding campaign through the Solomon Islands, and in the bitter fighting around Rabaul, the Japanese Navy had been hemorrhaging its most experienced pilots at a rate that far exceeded their ability to train qualified replacements. This wasn't a gradual attrition that could be managed through normal training pipelines. This was a hemorrhage in the most literal sense, a rapid loss of irreplaceable expertise and combat knowledge that represented the accumulated experience of years of training and combat operations. Saburo Sakai, who had emerged as one of Japan's leading surviving aces with an impressive tally of victories, had been pulled from combat operations after sustaining serious wounds in August of 1942. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, known among American pilots and Japanese alike as the Devil of Rabaul for his aggressive tactics and high kill count, had been killed while being transported as a passenger in October of 1943. The irony of one of Japan's most dangerous fighter pilots dying while sitting in the rear seat of a transport rather than in aerial combat was not lost on those who knew the circumstances. The men who had executed the audacious attack on Pearl Harbor, that core group of superbly trained aviators who had honed their skills over years of preparation, were mostly dead by this point in the war. They had been expended in the battles of 1942 and 1943, and the institutional knowledge they carried had died with them. Among the young men preparing for launch that June morning was Ensign Takeo Yamamoto, who had recently celebrated his 19th birthday. His total flight time amounted to 82 hours, a number that would have seemed laughably inadequate to American training standards.
His personal diary, which would be recovered after the war from his surviving family members, provides historians with one of the few detailed and intimate accounts of the psychological state that Japanese pilots were experiencing as they confronted American technological superiority with increasingly inadequate resources and training. 3 days before the battle that would claim his life, Yamamoto had written an entry that captured the cognitive dissonance between official propaganda and observed reality. "They tell us that spirit will overcome material disadvantage," he had noted with what seems like a mixture of hope and doubt. "But I have seen the American planes in the reconnaissance photographs. They are bigger than ours, newer than ours, more numerous than ours. How does spirit overcome radar that can see in darkness and through clouds? How does fighting spirit defeat an enemy who knows where you are before you can even see him?" The journey toward this moment of terrible reckoning had actually begun with troubling intelligence reports that had been filtering back to Japanese naval headquarters for months, reports that senior commanders had chosen to either dismiss as exaggerated or simply ignore because they didn't fit the prevailing narrative of eventual Japanese victory. In April of 1944, Japanese reconnaissance flights over American anchorages in the Marshall Islands had managed to photograph new types of carriers that defied easy comprehension when Japanese naval architects and intelligence officers examined the images. The Essex-class carriers represented a quantum leap in capability. Each vessel displaced 27,100 tons when fully loaded, and each could carry between 90 and 100 aircraft, a number that exceeded the capacity of Japan's largest carriers. The Japanese had counted 15 of these massive vessels already operational by April, and disturbingly, intelligence indicated that more were appearing on a monthly basis, rolling off American shipyards with an efficiency that suggested industrial capacity operating at scales Japanese planners had never seriously contemplated. Lieutenant Masaiko Okumiya, who served as air operations officer aboard the carrier Hio, had spent considerable time studying these reconnaissance photographs with growing alarm. In post-war interrogations conducted by American intelligence officers, he revealed just how limited their understanding had been. They knew the Americans had more carriers, he admitted, but they hadn't understood what that numerical advantage actually meant in practical operational terms. Each American carrier, he explained, had repair facilities and maintenance capabilities that Japanese ships couldn't dream of possessing. The Americans could fix damaged aircraft that the Japanese would simply push overboard as unsalvageable. One American carrier had more maintenance capability built into its design than the entire Japanese fleet possessed in aggregate. Commander Minoru Genda, who had earned fame as the tactical architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and now served on Admiral Toyoda's staff, had been reading captured American pilot interrogation reports with a sense of growing alarm that he tried to communicate to his superiors, though whether his concerns were taken seriously remains unclear. These reports indicated that American pilots were receiving 350 hours of primary training, followed by 200 hours of advanced training, and then another 100 hours of training with their actual squadrons before they were considered ready for combat operations. If these numbers were accurate, and Genda had no reason to believe they weren't given the source material, then every single American pilot entering combat had approximately 5 times the flight training that current Japanese aircrew were receiving. The implications were stark and unavoidable. They were sending children, relatively speaking, to fight against seasoned professionals, and no amount of indoctrination about fighting spirit could overcome that fundamental disparity in skill and experience. The morning of June 19th dawned with clear skies and bright conditions, the kind of perfect flying weather that would offer no concealment or tactical advantage to either force. At 4:30 in the morning, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, who was commanding the Japanese mobile fleet from the new carrier Taiho, ordered search planes launched to locate the American task force. These reconnaissance aircraft fanned out across the search sectors, their crews scanning the horizon and their primitive radar scopes for any sign of the enemy fleet. At 5 in the morning, Warrant Officer Sakai Manda, piloting one of these reconnaissance bombers, transmitted the first sighting report of American carriers. The force he had spotted was Task Force 58 under the command of Admiral Mark Mitcher, and it comprised a staggering concentration of naval power. 15 carriers formed the core of this force, supported by 7 battleships whose anti-aircraft batteries would prove devastatingly effective, 21 cruisers providing additional air defense and surface combat capability, and 69 destroyers screening the force and providing yet more anti-aircraft protection. At 7:30 in the morning, having received and analysed the reconnaissance reports, Admiral Ozawa made the decision to commit to battle and ordered the launch of his first strike wave, consisting of 69 aircraft drawn from multiple carriers. As these planes laboriously formed up into their attack formations, a process that took precious time and required the kind of coordination that inexperienced pilots struggled with, American radar operators aboard the battleship USS Alabama were already tracking them. The contacts appeared on their scopes at a distance of 150 miles, tiny blips that represented incoming aircraft that the Americans now had ample time to prepare for. Admiral Mitcher's response demonstrated the kind of decisive action that characterized American carrier operations by this point in the war. His order was simple and comprehensive: launch all available fighters. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat that American pilots would fly in this engagement had been specifically designed with one primary objective in mind: to defeat the Mitsubishi Zero that had dominated the early years of the Pacific Air War. Every aspect of the Hellcat's design reflected lessons learned from combat experience and a determination to create an aircraft that could beat the Zero not by trying to outturn it, which was essentially impossible given the Zero's lightweight and agility, but by leveraging superior power, speed, and durability. The Hellcat's Pratt & Whitney engine generated 2,000 horsepower compared to the Zero's 1,130, giving the American fighter a significant advantage in acceleration, top speed, and climb rate. Where the Zero had no armor protection for the pilot and no self-sealing fuel tanks, the Hellcat incorporated both features as standard equipment, meaning Hellcat pilots could survive hits that would kill Zero pilots and keep fighting after sustaining damage that would down a Zero. The armament disparity was equally telling. The Hellcat mounted 6 50-caliber machine guns concentrated in the wings that could deliver devastating firepower. Even a short burst from all 6 guns could literally tear a Zero apart in mid-air, while the Zero's lighter armament often required sustained fire to achieve kills against the more robust Hellcat. Lieutenant Alex Vratsiu, flying from the USS Lexington, would go on to achieve 6 confirmed victories during this single engagement, a feat that would contribute to his eventual status as one of the Navy's leading aces. His post-battle account of the action provides valuable insight into just how one-sided the fighting had become. The Japanese aircraft flew in predictable formations that made them easy to spot and target, he recalled. When American fighters dove on them from superior altitude, a tactic that had become standard operating procedure, the Japanese pilots tried to turn into the attack to bring their superior maneuverability to bear. But at the high speeds involved in these diving attacks, their flight controls locked up or became extremely heavy, robbing them of the agility that was supposed to be their primary advantage. The American pilots, by contrast, stayed fast and maintained their altitude advantage, making repeated slashing attacks that picked off Japanese aircraft one by one without exposing themselves to the kind of slow-speed turning fight where the Zero might have had a chance. The first wave of 69 Japanese aircraft launched that morning lost 41 planes to American fighters and anti-aircraft fire before they could even reach the American carriers to attempt their attacks. Of those losses, the vast majority fell to the Hellcats that intercepted them, with only a relative handful falling to the increasingly sophisticated anti-aircraft defenses that surrounded the American fleet. American losses in this first engagement amounted to exactly 1 Hellcat shot down, a kill ratio so lopsided that it almost defied belief. At 8:30 in the morning, either undeterred by the destruction of his first strike or simply unaware of how catastrophic the losses had been, Admiral Ozawa ordered the launch of his second strike wave. This strike comprised 128 aircraft,
making it the largest single coordinated carrier strike launched during the entire war, a massed formation that should have overwhelmed any defense through sheer numbers if traditional combat calculations held any validity. But the combat air patrol that the Americans had established operated according to principles that rendered traditional calculations obsolete. The defending fighters had been stacked in layers ranging from 17,000 feet up to 24,000 feet altitude, creating multiple barriers that attacking aircraft would have to penetrate. More importantly, these fighters were being controlled by fighter direction officers who sat in the ships below, watching radar scopes that showed them the entire tactical picture, seeing both their own fighters and the incoming Japanese aircraft, and using radio communications to coordinate the movements of hundreds of aircraft simultaneously. This level of centralized control and coordination was something the Japanese simply couldn't replicate with their inferior radar and communication systems. Yeoman Second Class Ito Takeshi, who served as a radio operator aboard one of the dive bombers in this second wave, survived the battle and provided a description that captures the sheer terror and helplessness that Japanese air crews experienced. The sky became a shooting gallery, he recalled, his words carrying the weight of trauma even in translation. American fighters came from every direction, always with the altitude advantage that allowed them to control the engagement. The Americans flew through their formation like sharks swimming through schools of fish, selecting targets at will and destroying them with bursts of fire that lasted only seconds. By noon, when the scattered survivors of the second wave began limping back toward their carriers or attempting to reach land bases, the losses had reached catastrophic proportions. Of the 128 aircraft launched, 97 had been shot down. American losses in defending against this massive strike amounted to 4 Hellcats, continuing the pattern of devastatingly one-sided kill ratios that characterized the entire battle. The third wave of 47 aircraft launched at 1000 hours, their leader being Lieutenant Commander Takeo Miyano, who had been promoted to his position only days earlier in a desperate attempt to fill leadership positions left vacant by mounting casualties. His final radio transmission, intercepted and recorded by American Signals Intelligence, captured the hopeless situation in stark terms. "Enemy fighters everywhere," he reported, his voice reportedly carrying undertones of resignation. "We cannot reach the target, cannot prosecute the attack." The Americans had achieved something close to total air superiority, and Japanese strike aircraft attempting to penetrate that defense were being slaughtered before they could get anywhere near their intended targets. The proximity fuse represented yet another technological revolution that contributed to American dominance, though this particular advantage manifested more in anti-aircraft fire than in air-to-air combat. The fourth wave of 48 aircraft launched at 1100 hours, but by this point, any semblance of coordinated strike planning had collapsed entirely. 49 aircraft, whether from this wave or earlier strikes, attempted to divert to Guam to refuel, perhaps hoping to regroup and mount another attack or simply seeking any safe haven. Instead, they flew directly into 27 Hellcats that had been positioned to intercept exactly this kind of diversionary movement. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, who would emerge from the war as the Navy's leading ace, described the engagement in terms that made it sound almost unsporting. "The Japanese aircraft were completely helpless," he noted. "They were trying to land, their landing gear down, their flaps extended, moving slowly and focused on the runway, rather than defending themselves. Attacking them under those circumstances was less a dogfight than an execution, but war rarely offers opportunities for fair fights, and the American pilots exploited the tactical situation with ruthless efficiency. Throughout these prolonged attacks that stretched across the entire morning and into the afternoon, American carriers maintained continuous flight operations for over 12 hours straight, a feat of coordination and deck crew efficiency that the Japanese simply couldn't match. American deck crews could rearm and refuel a fighter in approximately 15 minutes,
a process that had been refined through endless practice and benefited from superior equipment, better organization, and more plentiful supplies. Japanese carriers, struggling with less efficient equipment and increasingly exhausted crews, required nearly an hour to perform the same operations, meaning their ability to cycle aircraft and maintain continuous coverage was severely compromised. As the afternoon progressed and the aerial slaughter continued, catastrophe struck the Japanese carriers themselves, adding ship losses to the already catastrophic aircraft casualties. At 20 minutes past noon, the American submarine USS Albacore achieved firing position on the carrier Taiho, Admiral Ozawa's flagship, and one of the newest and most capable carriers in the Japanese fleet. The submarine fired a spread of 6 torpedoes at the carrier, and Warrant Officer Sakio Komatsu, who had just taken off from Taiho's deck, spotted the torpedo wakes from his cockpit. In an act of sacrifice that epitomized the kind of desperate courage that Japanese forces increasingly relied upon as their material situation deteriorated, Komatsu deliberately crashed his aircraft into one of the torpedoes, destroying it at the cost of his own life. His sacrifice saved Taiho from one hit, but the 6th torpedo in the spread struck home, rupturing fuel tanks and causing damage that initially seemed manageable. The real disaster came from poor damage control procedures that spread fuel vapors throughout the massive vessel. At 32 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, those accumulated vapors found an ignition source, and Taiho exploded in a catastrophic detonation that tore the ship apart. The carrier sank rapidly, taking 1,650 men down with her, including many of the staff officers who had been coordinating the Japanese fleet operations. At 20 minutes past 2, just minutes before Taiho's destruction, the carrier Shokaku, the very ship from which Lieutenant Commander Irikin had launched that morning with his premonitions of doom, took 3 torpedo hits from the American submarine USS Kavala. Without experienced damage control teams, many of the experienced personnel having been lost in earlier battles or reassigned, fires spread unchecked through the ship. At 1 minute past 3 in the afternoon, Shokaku suffered a massive explosion and sank, adding to the mounting toll of Japanese naval losses. As evening approached and Admiral Ozawa attempted to assess the situation facing his fleet, the statistics were simply staggering in their catastrophic implications. Of 430 aircraft launched from his carriers throughout the day, only 130 remained operational by nightfall. Some had been shot down, others had crashed attempting to land on Guam or other bases, some had ditched in the ocean when they ran out of fuel, and others had been damaged beyond repair, even if they made it back to their carriers. The Japanese had effectively lost their carrier air groups in a single day of combat, a rate of attrition that would have seemed impossible to anyone who hadn't witnessed it directly. On June 20th, the day following this catastrophe, Admiral Mitscher made the decision to launch a late afternoon strike of 216 aircraft at extreme range, pushing his forces to the limits of their operational radius in an attempt to finish off the retreating Japanese fleet. The strike succeeded in sinking the carrier Hio and damaging other vessels, but the late timing and extreme range meant that aircraft would be returning in darkness, a dangerous proposition even for well-trained pilots. Mitscher made the controversial decision to order all ships in Task Force 58 illuminated with every available light to guide his pilots home, essentially abandoning all light discipline and accepting the risk of submarine attack in order to save his returning air crew. Despite these extraordinary measures, 100 aircraft were lost in the recovery operations, many crashing into the ocean when they ran out of fuel or misjudged their approaches in the darkness. However, aggressive rescue operations by destroyers and other vessels meant that only 76 aircrew actually died, with the majority of those who went into the water being successfully recovered. The final statistics of what became known as the Battle of the Philippine Sea told a story of complete annihilation for Japanese naval aviation. Japanese losses included 3 fleet carriers sunk, approximately 600 aircraft destroyed when counting both carrier-based and land-based planes that participated in the battle, and nearly 3,000 personnel killed between aircrew and ship casualties. American losses amounted to 130 aircraft and 76 aircrew killed or missing, numbers that were certainly significant but paled in comparison to the devastation inflicted on the Japanese. The exchange ratio was so lopsided that it barely seemed credible. Post-war analysis by both American and Japanese military historians revealed just how decisive the American technological advantages had been. The proximity fuse, which used a miniature radar set in the shell to detonate when it came near an aircraft rather than requiring a direct hit, increased the kill probability of anti-aircraft fire by approximately 700% compared to conventional time-fused shells. The F-6F Hellcat would go on to achieve a 19-to-1 kill ratio over the course of the war, meaning that for every Hellcat lost in air combat, American pilots shot down 19 enemy aircraft. American radar systems that could track targets at 150 miles gave defending fighters an enormous advantage over Japanese radar that barely functioned beyond 50 miles. In 1944 alone, American factories produced 96,000 aircraft of all types, while Japan managed to produce 28,000, and the quality gap was arguably even more significant than the quantity gap. American factories operated continuously with multiple shifts and ample supplies of raw materials and skilled workers, while Japanese production operated sporadically, hampered by material shortages, bombing raids, and an increasingly desperate resource situation. The pilot training disparity had become genuinely insurmountable by this point in the war. American aviators were receiving 600 hours of training before entering combat, while Japanese pilots were being rushed through programs that averaged under 100 hours. This wasn't just a matter of flight time. The quality of instruction, the availability of fuel for training flights, the ability to practice live firing exercises, all of these factors favored the Americans. American carriers used steam catapults that could launch heavily loaded aircraft even in light wind conditions, while Japanese carriers still relied primarily on the ship steaming into the wind to generate enough airflow over the deck for launches, limiting their operational flexibility. In details that might seem trivial but actually spoke to deeper industrial capacity, American ships featured air conditioning systems that kept crew and equipment functioning efficiently in tropical heat, and even included ice cream machines as morale boosters. Japanese crews, by contrast, subsisted on rice rations that were often inadequate in both quantity and nutritional value, working in sweltering conditions that sapped efficiency and morale. The radar gap had proved absolutely decisive in this particular battle. American SK radar detected aircraft at 150 miles, providing ample warning time to scramble fighters and position them optimally. American fighters were equipped with 4-channel radios that provided clear reception and allowed complex coordination between pilots and fighter direction officers. Japanese radios barely functioned at all in many cases, with static, interference, and limited range making communication difficult even when aircraft were relatively close together. Admiral Ozawa's report to Naval Headquarters following the battle read like an obituary for Japanese carrier aviation. The first mobile fleet, he reported, had effectively ceased to exist as an offensive force. The carriers remained afloat, but they had no aircraft and no trained pilots to operate aircraft, even if they could obtain replacements. Admiral Toyoda, reviewing the strategic situation in the wake of the disaster, assessed that the Empire now faced a binary choice between surrender and complete annihilation, though political realities meant that surrender remained impossible to seriously contemplate at this point in the war. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, analysing the results of the Philippine Sea battle, reached conclusions that would later contribute to his advocacy for what would become the kamikaze special attack units. Conventional warfare, he argued, had become impossible for Japan to conduct successfully. They lacked the industry, the technology, and the resources to compete with American forces using traditional methods. If they couldn't match American quality or quantity in normal combat, perhaps suicide attacks that required minimal training and turned aircraft themselves into weapons might offer some hope of inflicting meaningful damage. Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, speaking about the victory from Washington, noted that every American worker had shared in this victory, that the men and women in the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh had won this battle alongside the pilots who flew the Hellcats and the sailors who crewed the ships. General Curtis LeMay, whose strategic bombing campaign would eventually lay waste to Japanese cities, acknowledged that the Navy's victory at the Philippine Sea had given the Army Air Forces a crucial opportunity. The Marianas Islands, seized following this naval victory, would provide bases for the B-29 Superfortress bombers that would carry the war to the Japanese home islands. Without eliminating Japanese naval aviation and securing the Marianas, the strategic bombing campaign that would characterize the final year of the war would have been impossible. Production statistics demonstrated just how hopeless Japan's position had become when viewed through the lens of industrial capacity. While Japan struggled to repair damaged carriers and maintain its existing fleet, American shipyards were completing 7 new carriers every single month, an assembly line approach to warship construction that would have seemed impossible before the war. Lieutenant Kaneyoshi Muto, assigned to pilot training duties after being injured in combat, described the impossible situation he faced trying to prepare pilots for combat. They were attempting to train pilots in 6 weeks, he explained, when the pre-war standard had been 2 years of intensive instruction. Sending these barely trained young men against Hellcats flown by experienced American pilots wasn't combat, it was murder. But there were no alternatives available. President Franklin Roosevelt emphasized in his public comments about the victory how American ingenuity, industrial might, and courage had united to create an invincible combination. Every rivet driven in a factory, every weld completed in a shipyard, every part manufactured in a workshop had contributed to this victory just as surely as the pilots who flew the combat missions. Admiral Chester Nimitz, analyzing the strategic implications from his headquarters in Hawaii, noted that while the Japanese fleet remained afloat, it had been rendered essentially impotent. American forces could now choose when and where to strike without facing any meaningful resistance from Japanese naval aviation. Lieutenant Commander Takashi Hirose, one of the few experienced Japanese aviators to survive the battle, provided perhaps the most succinct summary of what had occurred. "Courage without capability is worthless," he wrote in his personal journal. "Spirit without material support is suicide. The Americans had both courage and capability in abundance. In modern industrial war, courage alone is utterly insufficient to achieve victory." By sunset on June 20, 1944, Japanese carrier aviation had effectively ceased to exist as a viable fighting force. The air groups that had been built up over months of desperate training had been annihilated in history's most one-sided carrier battle. Admiral Ozawa's final detailed report to naval headquarters read like an epitaph for an entire branch of military service. The first mobile fleet had been rendered impotent, he reported. They had carriers, but those carriers had no aircraft to operate. They had aircraft in storage or under construction, but no trained pilots to fly them. They had pilot trainees in schools, but no time or resources to train them properly before they would be needed in combat. American material superiority had proven to be absolute and insurmountable. Carrier warfare, as the Japanese had understood and practiced it, had ended for them in the Philippine Sea. Commander David McCampbell, reflecting on the battle years later, noted that after the Philippine Sea engagement, American carrier forces never again faced serious opposition from Japanese naval aviation. The real victory, he argued, wasn't just in destroying the planes and killing the pilots in this particular battle, but in destroying Japan's ability to train adequate replacements for future battles. The experienced instructors were dead, the training fuel was unavailable, the time required for proper instruction was a luxury Japan no longer possessed. By the war's end, the production statistics told a story of overwhelming American industrial dominance. The United States had produced 141 aircraft carriers of various types, while Japan had managed to complete just 7. American factories had built 324,000 aircraft during the war years, while Japan had managed to produce 76,000. And again, the quality gap between American and Japanese aircraft had grown wider with each passing year. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the air attack on Pearl Harbor and survived the war to become one of its most thoughtful Japanese analysts, wrote what might be considered the most penetrating analysis of what the Battle of the Philippine Sea represented. They had attacked Pearl Harbor with 350 aircraft, he noted, thinking themselves invincible, believing that this bold strike would so damage American naval power that it would take years to recover, if recovery was even possible. The Americans had lost more aircraft than that in just 2 days of fighting at the Philippine Sea, without even pausing their operations, or considering it anything more than a tactical victory in an ongoing campaign. The Japanese had awakened an industrial machine that was now producing victories with the same efficiency and regularity that it produced automobiles, applying mass production techniques to warfare itself in ways that traditional military thinking hadn't fully anticipated. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had demonstrated conclusively that industrial warfare, when conducted by a power with genuinely massive productive capacity, could defeat traditional military prowess and fighting spirit, no matter how genuine or intense that spirit might be. The Japanese pilots who died in the Philippine Sea were no less brave than the veterans who had attacked Pearl Harbor. If anything, they were perhaps more courageous, knowing as many of them did that they were overmatched and outclassed, but flying anyway out of duty and loyalty. But courage meant absolutely nothing when facing radar-guided Hellcats flown by superbly trained pilots who could see you before you saw them, could coordinate their attacks using clear radio communications, and could survive damage that would kill you while inflicting damage that you couldn't survive. Lieutenant Commander Irakin's final diary entry, recovered after the Shokaku sank when personal effects were returned to his family, captured the fundamental truth that explained the outcome. They were not defeated by American fighting spirit or American courage, though the Americans possessed both qualities in abundance. He had written in what would be his last words. They were defeated by American factories, by an industrial system that could replace every destroyed plane with 2 better ones, that could replace every killed pilot with 3 new pilots who had superior training. They had fought against American industry itself and lost that fight decisively. The Americans had made warfare into mass production, applying assembly line principles to military operations, while the Japanese had remained artisans trying to compete in an assembly line age. The sun had set on Japanese naval aviation that evening in the Philippine Sea, and it would never rise again. The Hellcats that destroyed nearly 400 planes in 2 days of fighting had done more than win a battle or even a campaign. They had demonstrated that industrial democracy, when fully mobilized and coordinated toward a common purpose, could produce victory as surely and predictably as assembly lines produced automobiles or shipyards produced vessels. The turkey shoot, as American pilots dismissively called it, was over. The age of industrial warfare, where productive capacity and technological sophistication mattered more than traditional military virtues, had well and truly begun, and there was no going back. The implications of what had transpired in those waters extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. For the Japanese military leadership, the Battle of the Philippine Sea represented a moment of clarity that many had been avoiding for months or even years. The comfortable narratives about fighting spirit compensating for material disadvantage had been exposed as dangerous delusions. When Admiral Ozawa submitted his after-action report to Combined Fleet Headquarters, the document ran to dozens of pages filled with technical details and tactical analysis, but the essential message could be summarized in a single devastating sentence that appeared near the conclusion. The carrier force no longer possesses the capability to engage the American fleet in decisive battle. This wasn't an admission of temporary setback or a request for time to rebuild. This was a recognition that the fundamental equation of naval-air warfare had shifted so dramatically that Japan could no longer compete using conventional methods. The American intelligence officers who intercepted and translated Japanese communications in the days following the battle noted an almost palpable sense of despair in the messages passing between various headquarters. Junior officers were asking questions about future operations that their superiors seemed unable or unwilling to answer. Where would replacement aircraft come from when production facilities were already operating at maximum capacity? Where would trained pilots come from when the instructor corps had been decimated and fuel for training flights was increasingly scarce? How could carriers be employed offensively when they had no aircraft to operate? These weren't rhetorical questions posed by defeatists or cowards. These were practical operational concerns raised by professional officers who were trying to understand how they were supposed to continue fighting when the material basis for their branch of service had been destroyed. The individual stories of loss that emerged from Japanese sources in the years after the war added human dimension to the statistical catastrophe. Ensign Yamamoto, the 19-year-old pilot whose diary entries had captured the psychological state of inadequately trained aviators, had been shot down during the second wave attack. His aircraft had been hit by fire from a Hellcat flown by Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vratsiu, though neither pilot knew the other's identity at the time. Yamamoto had managed to bail out of his burning aircraft and had survived in the water for nearly 6 hours before being picked up by a Japanese destroyer. He had suffered severe burns to his hands and face from the fire that had consumed his cockpit, and he would spend weeks in a hospital ship receiving what limited medical care Japanese naval medicine could provide under wartime conditions. In a letter to his parents written from that hospital ship, recovered decades later when his family donated his papers to a military archive, Yamamoto described watching other pilots from his training class die around him. Of the 23 men I trained with, he wrote with painful precision, 17 are confirmed dead and 3 are missing and presumed dead. 3 of us survived with injuries. The mathematics of our survival are clear enough. We were not good enough, our planes were not good enough, our preparations were not good enough. The Americans were simply better in every way that mattered. Lieutenant Commander Irikin, whose premonitions of disaster had been so prescient, had not survived the sinking of the Shikaku. According to survivors from the carrier, he had been in the hangar deck when the torpedo hits occurred, trying to organize damage control parties. When the explosion that doomed the ship occurred, he had been thrown against a bulkhead with sufficient force to cause fatal injuries. A chief petty officer who had been nearby recalled that Irikin had remained conscious long enough to order the hangar deck crews to abandon their efforts and save themselves, but he had been unable to move himself due to his injuries. The officer who recovered Irikin's personal diary during the evacuation reported that the final entries, written in the hours before the battle, had displayed an almost eerie prescience about what was going to occur. He had understood, perhaps better than many more senior officers, that they were operating at a fundamental disadvantage that tactics and courage couldn't overcome. The American perspective on the battle, while triumphant in tone, also revealed interesting insights about how the war at sea had evolved by mid-1944. Commander McCampbell, in the more extensive debriefing he provided to intelligence officers several days after the battle, described the engagement in terms that emphasized how different it was from earlier carrier battles like Coral Sea or Midway. At those earlier battles, he explained, both sides had possessed roughly comparable technology and training levels. The outcomes had been determined by tactical decisions, intelligence advantages, and significant elements of luck. At the Philippine Sea, by contrast, the outcome had been predetermined by structural factors that existed before the first shot was fired. The Americans had better radar, better aircraft, better trained pilots, better maintenance, better coordination, and better logistics. Any one of those advantages might have been overcome or compensated for, but facing all of them simultaneously created a situation where Japanese defeat was essentially inevitable, regardless of how bravely individual pilots fought or how skillfully Japanese admirals maneuvered their forces. Lieutenant Vratsiu, whose 6 kills in a single mission had made him an instant celebrity when the story was released to the press, provided a more granular account of what air combat had been like during the battle. The Japanese formation, he recalled in his initial debriefing, had been flying in what appeared to be a textbook attack pattern,
the kind of formation that instructors taught in flight school as the proper way to approach a target. But textbook solutions only worked when your opponent didn't know you were coming, and in this case, American radar had been tracking them for well over an hour before they came within visual range. The defending Hellcats had been positioned at optimal altitude with the sun at their backs, and they had attacked from the one direction the Japanese formation was least prepared to defend against. Once that initial attack shattered the formation's cohesion, it had devolved into individual fights scattered across dozens of miles of sky, and in individual combat, the Hellcats' advantages in speed, power, and durability had proven decisive time and again. The anti-aircraft fire from American ships, which had accounted for a significant portion of Japanese losses, even though fighters had claimed the majority of kills, had also evolved dramatically since earlier battles. The integration of radar-directed fire control meant that American gunners were engaging targets at ranges that would have been considered impossible just 2 years earlier. The proximity-fused shells, which the Japanese didn't even know existed until they began examining unexploded examples recovered from their ships, had transformed anti-aircraft fire from an area saturation weapon into a precision tool. A traditional time-fused anti-aircraft shell had to explode at exactly the right moment to damage an aircraft, requiring gunners to accurately estimate range, altitude, and speed, then set the fuse accordingly. The proximity fuse eliminated most of that uncertainty. As long as the shell passed reasonably close to an aircraft, it would detonate automatically, and the resulting shrapnel pattern was lethal at distances of up to several dozen feet. The radar-directed gun directors that American ships employed represented another quantum leap in defensive capability. Traditional anti-aircraft gunnery had relied on optical tracking, which meant gunners had to see the target to engage it effectively. Smoke, clouds, sun glare, or simple distance could make optical tracking difficult or impossible. Radar-directed systems could track and engage targets in any weather, at any time of day, through smoke or clouds, at ranges where optical systems were useless. The heavy and light anti-aircraft batteries on American ships had been coordinated into a layered defense that forced attacking aircraft to fly through multiple zones of fire, each optimized for different ranges and altitudes. Japanese pilots who survived the gauntlet of American fighters often found themselves flying into walls of anti-aircraft fire that seemed almost impossible to penetrate. The logistical aspects of the battle, less dramatic than the aerial combat but equally important to the outcome, demonstrated yet another dimension of American superiority. Throughout the 2 days of intense operations, American carriers had maintained continuous flight operations without any significant interruption for maintenance or resupply. The deck crews, working in brutal heat with minimal rest, had somehow sustained the tempo of operations that kept hundreds of aircraft cycling through launch, recovery, rearm, and refuel cycles. Aviation gasoline had flowed continuously from below-deck tanks to thirsty aircraft. Ammunition had moved from magazines to aircraft without shortage or delay. Replacement aircraft and pilots from escort carriers and shore bases had arrived to fill gaps. The entire system had functioned with a smooth efficiency that Japanese observers, if they could have witnessed it, would have found almost incomprehensible. Japanese carriers, by contrast, had struggled with basic logistics throughout the battle. Aviation gasoline supplies had been tight even before the battle began, with some carriers rationing fuel to ensure they could launch strikes. Ammunition had been in short supply for certain aircraft types, forcing some pilots to fly with reduced loads. Replacement aircraft existed in theory, but getting them from shore bases to carriers required logistics systems that were barely functioning under the pressure of American submarine attacks and air raids. The maintenance facilities aboard Japanese carriers, already inferior to their American counterparts in terms of equipment and capability, were staffed by mechanics who were exhausted and increasingly demoralized as the war situation deteriorated. Aircraft that American crews would have repaired and returned to service within hours were being written off as total losses because Japanese crews lacked the tools, parts, or expertise to fix them.
The submarine attacks that sank Taiho and Shokaku represented yet another dimension of American naval superiority that had been building throughout the war. American submarines operating in the Pacific by mid-1944 had finally resolved the torpedo problems that had plagued them during the first 2 years of the war. The Mark 14 torpedo, which had been infamous for running too deep, failing to explode, or breaking apart on contact with targets, had been incrementally improved through field modifications and factory fixes until it was finally a reliable weapon. The submarines themselves had evolved in their tactics and doctrine, learning through hard experience how to effectively attack warships while avoiding the increasingly sophisticated Japanese anti-submarine forces. The USS Albacore, which had torpedoed Taiho, had been tracking the Japanese carrier force for nearly 12 hours before achieving a firing position. Commander James Blanchard, the submarine's commanding officer, had patiently maneuvered his boat through the screen of destroyers, endured depth charge attacks when he was detected, and waited for the opportunity that came when Taiho turned into the wind to launch aircraft. The carrier's turn had opened a firing window that lasted less than 3 minutes, and Blanchard had made the most of it with a spread of torpedoes that combined careful aim with a degree of luck. The USS Kavala, which sank Shokaku, had enjoyed somewhat easier approach conditions, but had still required skillful handling to penetrate the destroyer screen and achieve firing position without being detected and driven off by depth charges. The Japanese anti-submarine doctrine and equipment had improved somewhat since the early days of the war, but it had never reached the level of sophistication that the Allies, particularly the British, had developed in the Atlantic. Japanese destroyers lacked the advanced sonar systems that allowed effective submarine detection. Their depth charges were less effective than Allied models, and their tactics for prosecuting submarine contacts were often textbook responses that experienced submarine commanders had learned to predict and evade. The loss of 2 fleet carriers to submarine attack in a single day represented not just bad luck, but a systematic failure in anti-submarine warfare that Japanese naval forces had never adequately addressed. The human cost of these submarine attacks extended beyond the raw numbers of casualties. Both Taiho and Shokaku had carried not just their crews, but also the air groups that would have operated from those carriers, along with maintenance personnel, intelligence officers, and various specialists. When the ships sank, they took with them not just bodies, but expertise, experience, and institutional knowledge that couldn't be replaced. The administrative records that tracked personnel assignments, training records, maintenance logs, and operational procedures all went down with the ships, creating gaps in organizational memory that would hamper Japanese efforts to rebuild their carrier forces, even if they could somehow obtain replacement ships and aircraft. The American rescue operations that followed the late afternoon strike on June 20th, when over 100 aircraft ditched or crashed trying to recover aboard their carriers in darkness, showcased yet another area where American practices surpassed Japanese capabilities. Admiral Mitcher's decision to illuminate the fleet with every available light source, turning Task Force 58 into what one pilot described as a floating city blazing with light, was controversial among some officers who worried about submarine attack. But Mitcher had correctly calculated that the risk of submarine attack was less important than saving trained aircrew, and the decision reflected a fundamental difference in how the two navies valued their personnel. American doctrine and practice emphasized saving aircrew whenever possible because trained pilots represented a scarce and valuable resource that took months to create and years to develop into expert combat aviators. Destroyers had been positioned at intervals along the expected return route specifically to pick up ditched aircrew. These destroyers carried rescue swimmers, medical personnel, and equipment specifically designed for recovering men from the water. Their crews had been trained in rescue procedures and had practiced them repeatedly. When planes began going into the water as they ran out of fuel approaching the fleet, these destroyers had sprung into action, using searchlights to locate men in the water, maneuvering carefully to recover them without running them over, and providing immediate medical care to those who needed it. The results spoke for themselves. Of the 100 aircraft lost during the recovery operations, 76 aircrew had died, while 124 had been rescued alive. Given that many of the aircraft carried 2 or 3 crew members, this represented a rescue rate of approximately 60%, an extraordinary achievement under difficult conditions of darkness, rough seas, and scattered impact points across dozens of miles of ocean. Japanese rescue operations, by contrast, had been haphazard and often ineffective throughout the battle. Japanese destroyers lacked the specialized equipment and trained personnel for effective rescue work. Japanese doctrine placed less emphasis on rescuing ditched aircrew, partly because they had fewer resources to devote to rescue operations, but also because cultural factors made such efforts seem less important than continuing the attack. The result was that Japanese aircrew who ditched or bailed out over water had significantly lower survival rates than their American counterparts, even when they came down relatively close to friendly forces. The medical care available to wounded personnel represented yet another disparity that affected both survival rates and morale. American carriers and other major warships carried fully equipped sick bays staffed by trained medical officers and corpsmen. They had supplies of blood plasma for transfusions, antibiotics for fighting infection, surgical capabilities for treating severe wounds, and enough medical personnel to provide continuous care to multiple casualties. Japanese ships had medical personnel and facilities, but they were less well-equipped and supplied than their American counterparts. The shortage of antibiotics, which were difficult for Japan to manufacture in sufficient quantities, meant that wounds that American medics could treat effectively often led to fatal infections when they occurred to Japanese personnel. The shortage of trained medical personnel meant that Japanese ships often had to choose which wounded men to treat when casualties were heavy, a terrible decision that American medical personnel rarely had to make. The technological disparities that had proven so decisive in this battle extended into areas that might not seem directly related to combat capability, but actually had profound effects. American ships, for instance, had distillation plants that could produce fresh water from seawater, meaning they could remain at sea for extended periods without worrying about water supplies. This fresh water supported not just drinking and cooking, but also allowed crews to maintain hygiene, wash clothing, and keep themselves comfortable in tropical conditions. Japanese ships had more limited water production capability, forcing crews to ration water carefully and endure conditions that would have been considered unacceptable aboard American vessels. The cumulative effect of better food, better water, air conditioning, better medical care, and better living conditions was that American crews remained healthier, more comfortable, and more capable of sustained operations than their Japanese counterparts who were dealing with inadequate supplies, tropical heat, and deteriorating conditions. The intelligence picture that American forces possessed going into this battle had been far superior to what the Japanese understood about American capabilities and dispositions. American code-breaking efforts, particularly the work being done at Pearl Harbor and other facilities to decrypt Japanese naval communications, had provided Admiral Spruance and Admiral Mitscher with valuable insights into Japanese intentions and force composition. They had known that the Japanese were planning a major engagement, had a reasonably accurate count of how many carriers the Japanese had available, and understood, at least in general terms, what the Japanese hoped to accomplish. This intelligence advantage had allowed American commanders to position their forces optimally and prepare for the specific type of battle they expected to fight. Japanese intelligence about American forces, by contrast, had been fragmentary and often inaccurate. Their reconnaissance capabilities had been degraded by losses of long-range reconnaissance aircraft and the crews trained to operate them. Their code-breaking efforts against American communications had been less successful than American efforts against Japanese codes, partly because American communication security had improved dramatically since early war disasters, and partly because the Japanese had devoted fewer resources to signals intelligence. The result was that Japanese commanders had been operating with an incomplete and sometimes incorrect understanding of what forces they faced and what capabilities those forces possessed. Admiral Ozawa had underestimated the number of carriers in Task Force 58, had not fully appreciated how effective American combat air patrols would be, and had not understood the extent to which American technological advantages would negate traditional Japanese tactical advantages. The command and control systems that each side employed during the battle reflected broader patterns of organizational philosophy and technological capability. American forces operated using a relatively decentralized command structure that pushed tactical decision-making down to relatively junior officers while maintaining strategic coordination through radio communications and standardized procedures. Fighter direction officers, often lieutenants or lieutenant commanders, had the authority to vector fighters toward threats and coordinate defensive efforts without needing to request permission from senior admirals for each tactical decision. Pilots were encouraged to exercise initiative within the framework of their mission orders, taking advantage of opportunities as they arose rather than waiting for permission. This combination of clear strategic direction with tactical flexibility allowed American forces to respond rapidly to changing circumstances and exploit opportunities that more rigid command structures might have missed. Japanese command and control, by contrast, tended toward more centralized decision-making that concentrated authority in the hands of senior officers while expecting subordinates to execute orders without much deviation. This approach had worked reasonably well in the early war when Japanese forces possessed superiority and could dictate the terms of engagement, but it became a liability when facing the kind of fluid, fast-moving air battles that characterized the Philippine Sea engagement. By the time reports of American fighters intercepting strike waves reached Admiral Ozawa aboard his flagship, the tactical situation had already evolved beyond the point where his intervention could make any difference. The strike leaders who might have adjusted their tactics in response to the overwhelming opposition they encountered lacked the authority or perhaps the training to make such adjustments without orders from above. And by the time those orders could have been formulated and transmitted, the battles were already over. The training pipeline disparities that had contributed so heavily to this defeat had their roots in decisions made years earlier, when Japan was still ascendant and American forces were reeling from defeats. In 1942 and early 1943, when Japanese naval aviation was sustaining heavy losses in the grinding campaigns around Guadalcanal and the Solomons, Japanese naval leadership had faced a critical choice about how to respond to aircrew attrition. They could have pulled experienced pilots out of combat to serve as instructors, accepting short-term weakness in frontline units to build long-term strength in training programs. Instead, they had chosen to keep experienced pilots in combat roles, reasoning that their expertise was needed immediately to win current battles. The experienced instructors who might have trained the next generation of pilots had instead died in combat, taking their knowledge and skills with them and leaving training programs in the hands of less qualified instructors who couldn't provide the same quality of education. American forces had made the opposite choice, systematically rotating experienced combat pilots back to training commands where they could pass their knowledge to new generations of aviators. Men who had survived intense combat and learned hard lessons about what worked and what didn't in aerial warfare had been pulled from frontline squadrons despite the short-term impact on combat capability and assigned to training duties where they taught classes, flew training missions, and shared their expertise with thousands of student pilots. The result was that American training programs benefited from constantly updated combat experience, incorporating lessons learned from recent battles into the curriculum within weeks or months rather than years. Japanese training programs, staffed increasingly by instructors who had limited or no combat experience, taught tactics and techniques that might have been effective in 1941 but were outdated by 1944. The industrial mobilization that had enabled American naval dominance by mid-1944 represented a triumph of economic planning, industrial organization, and national commitment that few observers in 1941 would have predicted. The United States had entered the war with a relatively small navy, limited aircraft production capacity, and a military that ranked below Portugal in terms of total manpower. But the industrial potential had been enormous, waiting only for mobilization to convert civilian production to military purposes. The automobile factories that had produced millions of civilian vehicles were retooled to produce tanks, aircraft engines, and military trucks. The shipyards that had built merchant vessels and passenger ships began launching warships with assembly line efficiency. Universities and industrial laboratories organized research programs that systematically pursued technological improvements in everything from radar to metallurgy to cryptography. The scale of this industrial mobilization was difficult to comprehend, even for those who witnessed it firsthand. The United States was producing one aircraft carrier every month by mid-1944, a rate of production that seemed almost fantastical. These weren't small escort carriers, but large fleet carriers displacing over 25,000 tons and capable of operating nearly 100 aircraft each. The shipyards accomplished this through radical innovations in construction techniques, including modular building methods that allowed different sections of a ship to be constructed simultaneously in different locations and then assembled, welding techniques that were faster and more reliable than traditional riveting, and standardized designs that eliminated the custom engineering that had characterized pre-war shipbuilding. The workforce that accomplished this included millions of workers, many of them women who had entered industrial employment for the first time, trained in accelerated programs and integrated into production processes with remarkable efficiency. Aircraft production had expanded even more dramatically than shipbuilding. The United States was producing over 8,000 aircraft per month by mid-1944, a number that exceeded Japan's entire annual production. These weren't simple aircraft, but increasingly sophisticated machines that incorporated the latest technological advances. The factories that produced these aircraft had themselves been built during the war, massive facilities that covered hundreds of acres and employed tens of thousands of workers. The supply chains that fed these factories stretched across the entire continent and beyond, bringing together aluminum from one region, engines from another, instruments from a third, and thousands of other components that had to arrive in the right quantities at the right times to keep production lines moving. The pilot training infrastructure that supported this aircraft production had expanded proportionally. The United States had established dozens of new airfields specifically for training purposes, scattered across the southern states where weather allowed year-round flying. These facilities trained tens of thousands of pilots annually, putting them through carefully structured programs that progressed from basic flight skills through advanced combat techniques. The fuel available for training purposes alone exceeded Japan's total aviation fuel budget, allowing American students to build flight hours through repetition and practice that Japanese students simply couldn't match. The instructors staffing these training programs, many of them combat veterans as mentioned earlier, could provide one-on-one attention and detailed feedback that accelerated the learning process. Japan's industrial mobilization, while impressive in its own right, operated under constraints that prevented it from matching American production levels. The home islands lacked many critical raw materials, forcing Japan to import iron ore from Manchuria, oil from the East Indies, and other materials from conquered territories. American submarines and aircraft were systematically destroying the merchant shipping that carried these materials, creating bottlenecks that forced Japanese factories to operate below capacity despite desperate need for their products. The bombing raids that began reaching Japan itself in late 1944 damaged factories and disrupted production, forcing dispersal of industry to smaller workshops that were less efficient than large centralized factories. The workforce available for industrial production was smaller than America's and less trained, and as the war dragged on, Japan faced increasingly severe labor shortages as men were drafted for military service. The fuel situation alone crippled Japan's ability to sustain military operations at the scale required to compete with American forces. Japan had entered the war with limited oil reserves and had counted on capturing and holding the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies to solve this problem. While they had successfully captured these fields, producing oil from them, refining it into usable products, and transporting it to Japan or forward bases required infrastructure and shipping that American submarines were destroying faster than it could be replaced. By mid-1944, fuel shortages were affecting every aspect of Japanese military operations. Training flights were being curtailed or cancelled to conserve fuel for combat operations. Naval vessels operated at reduced speeds or remained in port to save fuel. Aircraft were being assigned to one-way missions not because the pilots were necessarily intending suicide, but because there wasn't enough fuel for round trips. The cultural and political factors that shaped each nation's approach to the war added another layer of complexity to understanding the Battle of the Philippine Sea and its implications. The American political system, for all its faults and inefficiencies, had proven capable of mobilizing national resources and maintaining public support for a global war that required enormous sacrifices. The government back in Washington had not hidden defeat or softened bad news, instead using honest reporting about setbacks to strengthen public resolve and justify the massive effort required for victory. The democratic process, which might have seemed like a weakness in wartime, had actually provided a safety valve for political tensions and a mechanism for adapting strategy to changing circumstances. Japan's political system, dominated by military leaders who operated with limited civilian oversight, had made strategic decisions that look increasingly questionable with the benefit of hindsight. The decision to go to war with the United States in the first place had been based on assumptions about American resolve and industrial capacity that proved wildly inaccurate. The belief that a series of early victories would convince the Americans to negotiate a settlement had ignored the fundamental character of American political culture and the nature of industrial democracy. Once attacked, the American people had proven willing to endure years of warfare and enormous casualties to achieve victory, a staying power that Japanese planners had not anticipated. The decision to expand the war rather than consolidating gains had stretched Japanese forces thin and created vulnerable positions that American forces could attack without having to assault the most heavily defended positions. The Battle of the Philippine Sea marked a point of no return for Japanese naval strategy. Before this engagement, Japanese commanders could still entertain hopes, however unrealistic, of achieving a decisive battle that would cripple American naval power and force a negotiated settlement. After the Philippine Sea, such hopes were no longer tenable, even as fantasies. The carrier force that had been the instrument of Japanese naval power and the foundation of their Pacific strategy had been destroyed not just in terms of ships, but in terms of the trained aircrew and organizational capability required to operate carriers effectively. The ships that survived the battle were essentially useless without aircraft and pilots, and Japan no longer had the resources or time to regenerate carrier air groups at anything approaching the scale required to challenge American forces. The strategic implications extended in multiple directions, reshaping the entire Pacific War in ways that would become clear over the following months. With Japanese carrier aviation eliminated as a threat, American forces gained freedom of movement and action that had previously been constrained by the need to guard against carrier strikes. Admiral Nimitz could now plan operations against targets that would have been too risky before, knowing that the Japanese couldn't concentrate carrier air power to interfere. The invasion of the Mariana Islands, which was already underway when the naval battle occurred, proceeded with the certainty that Japanese forces couldn't mount effective air attacks against the invasion fleet or the landing forces. The capture of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam would provide the bases needed for B-29 strategic bombing raids against the Japanese home islands, bringing the war directly to Japanese cities and industrial centers in ways that would prove devastating. The psychological impact of the defeat on Japanese military morale, while difficult to quantify, was profound and far-reaching. The narrative of Japanese superiority in spirit and fighting quality had sustained morale through earlier setbacks, allowing commanders to explain defeats as temporary reverses that would be overcome through greater effort and dedication. The scale and one-sidedness of the Philippine Sea disaster made such explanations increasingly implausible. Junior officers who had believed in ultimate Japanese victory began questioning whether victory was even possible. Enlisted personnel who had been told that American pilots were inferior discovered that American pilots were actually far superior in training and equipment.
The gap between propaganda and reality became too wide to ignore, creating doubts that would only grow as the war situation continued to deteriorate. The American public reaction to the victory, while celebratory, also revealed interesting aspects of how the American home front understood and engaged with the war. Newspaper headlines trumpeted the turkey shoot and the overwhelming victory, providing specifics about Japanese aircraft destroyed and American losses that would have seemed unbelievable if they hadn't been confirmed by official sources. The public was hungry for good news after years of war, and the Philippine Sea provided exactly the kind of clear, decisive victory that boosted morale and justified the enormous sacrifices being made on the home front. War bond drives that followed the battle exceeded their goals, with organizers explicitly linking the victory to the industrial mobilization that bonds helped finance. The message was clear. American workers building planes and ships had contributed directly to this victory, and continued effort would bring more victories and ultimate triumph. The tactical lessons that both sides drew from the battle influenced their subsequent operations in contrasting ways. American forces, analyzing their overwhelming success, identified areas where they could improve even further. Fighter direction techniques were refined based on lessons learned. Aircraft recovery procedures were modified to reduce losses during night operations. Maintenance practices were adjusted to keep even higher percentages of aircraft operational. The anti-aircraft coordination that had worked so well was studied and enhanced. The American approach was to treat even an overwhelming victory as a learning opportunity, systematically examining every aspect of the operation to identify potential improvements. Japanese forces, grappling with catastrophic defeat, faced harder choices about lessons learned. Some officers argued that the fundamental strategy needed to change, that conventional operations against American industrial might were futile, and that new approaches needed to be developed. This line of thinking would eventually contribute to the adoption of kamikaze tactics, the deliberate use of suicide attacks as a way to inflict damage when conventional attacks had proven ineffective. Other officers argued that the problem wasn't strategy, but execution, that with better training and more resources, they could still compete effectively. This debate would continue through the remainder of the war, with the desperate realities of Japan's situation eventually forcing acceptance of increasingly extreme measures. The longer-term effects of the Battle of the Philippine Sea on naval doctrine and carrier warfare would extend well beyond World War II itself. The battle demonstrated conclusively that carriers required not just ships and aircraft, but comprehensive systems including radar, communications, logistics, maintenance, and above all, superbly trained personnel. The integration of all these elements into a coherent fighting system was what gave American carriers their decisive advantage, and this lesson would shape naval aviation development for decades to come. The battle also showed the importance of technological superiority in modern warfare, validating the enormous investments in radar development, aircraft design, and other technical programs that had seemed expensive and risky when first undertaken. The human stories that emerged from the battle, both American and Japanese, provided glimpses into the individual experiences that lay behind the statistics and strategic analysis. American pilots who achieved multiple kills in single missions became celebrities, feted in the press and welcomed as heroes when they returned home. Their accounts of combat, while sometimes sanitized for public consumption, conveyed the excitement and danger of aerial combat to audiences that had never experienced anything similar. These pilots understood that their success was built on advantages in training and equipment that their Japanese opponents lacked, but they also took pride in their skills and courage, and rightly so. Being advantaged didn't make combat any less dangerous or individual acts of bravery any less significant. Japanese survivors faced a different kind of reception when they returned to their units or to Japan. In a military culture that valued success and punished failure, survivors of catastrophic defeats were sometimes treated with suspicion or contempt. Some pilots who had survived by ditching their aircraft or bailing out faced accusations that they had abandoned their planes prematurely,
failing to press home attacks or fight to the death. The cultural weight of shame and failure could be crushing, driving some survivors to volunteer for increasingly dangerous missions in attempts to redeem themselves. Others quietly endured the stigma, understanding that they had been sent into an impossible situation but lacking the political capital to say so openly. The medical aftermath of the battle, particularly for wounded Japanese personnel, illustrated the declining state of Japanese military medicine as resources became scarce. American wounded who were treated aboard ship and then evacuated to rear-area hospitals had access to the latest medical techniques, adequate supplies of blood plasma and antibiotics, and skilled surgeons and physicians. Their survival rates reflected this quality of care. Japanese wounded faced much grimmer prospects. Ships lacked adequate medical supplies and personnel. The antibiotics that could prevent infection and save lives were in desperately short supply. Evacuation to hospitals ashore meant long, dangerous voyages through submarine-infested waters. Many wounded who might have survived with proper care died instead from infections, complications, or simple lack of treatment capacity. The intelligence windfall that American forces gained from the battle extended beyond tactical lessons to strategic insights about Japanese capabilities and intentions. Captured documents and equipment from downed aircraft provided details about Japanese radar technology, aircraft performance, and tactical doctrine. Interrogations of captured pilots, though relatively few survived to be captured, revealed information about training programs, morale, and unit organization. Communications intercepts during and after the battle exposed Japanese assessment of their own situation and their plans for future operations. All of this intelligence fed into American planning for subsequent operations, allowing commanders to exploit Japanese weaknesses and avoid their remaining strengths. The logistical demands of sustaining Task Force 58 during and after the battle demonstrated American mastery of fleet logistics, an unglamorous but absolutely critical aspect of naval operations. The ammunition expended by ships and aircraft during the battle needed to be replaced. Aircraft that were damaged needed to be repaired or replaced. Aviation gasoline reserves needed to be replenished. Food and other supplies for crews needed to be provided. All of this required a logistics system that extended thousands of miles back to bases and ports, involving fleet oilers that could refuel ships at sea, ammunition ships that could transfer ordnance while underway, and supply vessels carrying everything from spare parts to coffee. The efficiency of this system allowed American forces to sustain operations far from their bases for extended periods, while Japanese forces were increasingly tied to bases because their logistics system couldn't support extended at-sea operations. The role of leadership at various levels in determining the battle's outcome deserves examination beyond simple heroic narratives or condemnations of failure. Admiral Spruance, commanding the overall American force, made the controversial decision to prioritize protecting the American landing forces at Saipan rather than aggressively pursuing the Japanese fleet. This meant that the Japanese carriers that survived the battle were able to withdraw rather than being hunted down and sunk, leading some critics to argue that Spruance missed an opportunity for even more decisive victory. Spruance defended his decision by noting that his primary mission was protecting the landing forces, and that pursuing the Japanese fleet would have taken him away from that mission. The debate about whether Spruance made the right choice continues among historians, but the battle was certainly a decisive American victory, regardless of whether it could have been even more complete. Admiral Mitcher, commanding the carrier task force, demonstrated aggressive and effective tactics throughout the battle, using his radar-equipped fighters to maximum advantage and coordinating his air groups with skill. His decision to illuminate the fleet to recover aircraft after the late strike showed a willingness to take calculated risks to preserve trained aircrew, a decision that reflected both tactical judgment and an understanding of where real value lay. Mitcher's leadership style, which involved trusting his subordinates and pushing decision-making down to lower levels, enabled the kind of rapid response and tactical flexibility that characterized American operations. Admiral Ozawa faced impossible constraints that limited his options and essentially predetermined his defeat. He was operating with inferior aircraft flown by inadequately trained pilots, supported by inferior radar and communications, facing an enemy that knew he was coming and was prepared to receive him. His decision to commit to battle despite these disadvantages reflected the strategic situation Japan faced, where doing nothing guaranteed eventual defeat, while attacking at least offered some chance, however slim, of achieving results. Ozawa's tactical decisions during the battle were reasonable given his limited understanding of the tactical situation and the constraints he faced, but no amount of tactical skill could overcome the fundamental disadvantages his forces suffered. The battle's impact on the careers and reputations of the leaders involved followed patterns that reflected the different military cultures. American commanders who participated in the victory saw their reputations enhanced, with several going on to more senior positions and post-war recognition. Japanese commanders associated with the defeat faced more complicated aftermath. Some were quietly reassigned to shore positions where their perceived failure wouldn't affect frontline operations. Others remained in command positions but operated under the shadow of this defeat, expected to somehow achieve better results despite facing even worse conditions as the war situation deteriorated further. The propaganda value of the victory for the American war effort was substantial and was exploited systematically by government information services. The turkey shoot became a symbol of American technical superiority and fighting skill, a proof point that American industrial might and training programs were producing the tools and personnel needed for victory. Films, radio broadcasts, and print media carried the message to domestic and international audiences, strengthening Allied morale while demoralizing enemies and neutral nations that might have been considering which side to support. The Japanese government, by contrast, struggled to explain the disaster to its own population without admitting the extent of the defeat or undermining public morale, resorting to vague language about setbacks and continued determination that convinced fewer and fewer people as the war dragged on. The technological race that had contributed to American advantages at the Philippine Sea continued after the battle, with American research and development efforts producing new and improved equipment, while Japanese programs struggled with resource constraints and bombing damage to research facilities. American radar continued to improve, with new models offering better range and resolution. Aircraft designs evolved to incorporate combat lessons and technological advances. Proximity fuses became more reliable and effective. Japanese research programs, while they achieved some successes, couldn't match the scale or intensity of American efforts, and the gap in technological sophistication continued to widen. The Battle of the Philippine Sea occurred at a point in World War II when the ultimate outcome was no longer seriously in doubt among informed observers, though the war would continue for another 14 months with enormous additional casualties on all sides. The battle accelerated the timetable for American victory by eliminating Japanese naval aviation as a factor in future operations, but it didn't change the fundamental trajectory of the war. Japan had lost any realistic chance of victory long before June 1944, probably as early as the defeat at Midway in June 1942, or perhaps even earlier when the decision to attack the United States brought American industrial might into the war on the Allied side. What the Philippine Sea battle did was make this reality unmistakably clear even to those who had been clinging to hopes of a negotiated settlement or a decisive victory that would change the strategic equation. The environmental conditions during the battle, while less dramatic than the combat itself, played a role in how events unfolded. The clear weather that characterized both days of fighting provided excellent visibility for both sides, but favored the Americans whose radar gave them an advantage that didn't depend on visual conditions. The sea state was moderate, making carrier operations feasible but challenging, particularly during the night recovery operations when pilots were exhausted and fuel was running low. The heat and humidity of the tropical Pacific affected both sides, but may have impacted Japanese forces more severely, given their less adequate ventilation and air conditioning systems aboard ships. The impact of the battle on civilians in Japan and the occupied territories was less immediate than the impact on military forces, but no less significant in the longer term. The loss of carrier aviation meant that American forces could operate with greater freedom, accelerating the advance toward the Japanese home islands. This advance would bring American bombing raids to Japanese cities, causing enormous civilian casualties and destroying much of Japan's urban infrastructure. The capture of the Marianas, enabled by the naval victory, put B-29 bombers within range of Tokyo and other major cities, beginning a strategic bombing campaign that would kill hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians and leave millions homeless. For civilians in territories occupied by Japan, the battle's outcome offered both hope and additional suffering. The progress of American forces toward Japan raised hopes of eventual liberation from Japanese occupation, but the fighting that would be required to achieve that liberation would cause additional casualties and destruction. The deteriorating Japanese military situation also led to harsher treatment of occupied populations as Japanese forces became more desperate and resources became scarcer. The complex interplay between military operations and civilian experience is often oversimplified in military histories that focus on battles and commanders, but the Philippine Sea Battle had profound effects on millions of people who never saw a warship or military aircraft. The post-war analysis of the battle by military historians and strategists generated insights that influenced naval doctrine for decades. The importance of superior technology, comprehensive training, and effective integration of systems became fundamental principles of naval aviation. The demonstration that numerical superiority could be overcome by qualitative advantages validated investment in advanced equipment and extensive training programs. The role of intelligence in enabling effective operational planning was reinforced, justifying continued investment in reconnaissance, signals intelligence, and other information-gathering capabilities. The battle became a case study taught in military academies and staff colleges, analysed for lessons about leadership, tactics, technology, and strategy. The personal memoirs and histories published by participants on both sides in the years and decades following the war added detail and human perspective to the historical record. American pilots wrote accounts that ranged from triumphant to reflective, some emphasizing the heroism and excitement of combat, while others acknowledged the sadness of killing and being killed, even in a just cause. Japanese survivors who wrote about their experiences often emphasized the sense of futility and waste they had felt fighting against overwhelming odds with inadequate equipment. The officers who had commanded forces during the battle published their own accounts, sometimes defensive and self-justifying, sometimes brutally honest about mistakes and failures. The battle's place in the broader narrative of World War II and military history has evolved over time as new sources become available and historical perspectives shift. Early accounts, written when many participants were still alive and wartime classifications still restricted access to documents, sometimes presented simplified narratives that emphasized heroism and clear-cut victories. Later accounts, benefiting from access to Japanese sources and declassified intelligence materials, presented more nuanced pictures that acknowledged complexity and moral ambiguity while still recognizing the fundamental reality of who won and who lost. The battle remains one of the most one-sided major naval engagements in history, a demonstration of what happens when substantial advantages in technology, training, and resources combine to create overwhelming superiority. The technological artifacts that survived the battle, including wrecked aircraft and ship debris on the ocean floor, provide physical evidence for researchers and serve as memorials to those who died. Underwater exploration of the wrecks has revealed details about ship construction, damage patterns, and the circumstances of sinking that complement written records. Aircraft recovered from the ocean floor have allowed detailed examination of design features, construction techniques, and combat damage. These physical artifacts connect modern observers to historical events in ways that documents alone cannot, providing tangible links to the men who built, operated, and died in these machines. The commemoration of the battle in monuments, museums, and ceremonies reflects both American triumph and Japanese grief, though in different ways, shaped by different cultural approaches to remembering war. American commemorations emphasize the skill and courage of the men who achieved victory, celebrating their success while acknowledging the sacrifices made. Japanese commemorations tend toward mourning the dead and reflecting on the tragedy of war, sometimes avoiding direct confrontation with questions about responsibility for a war that brought such suffering. Both approaches have value and limitations, and both contribute to historical memory in complex ways. The lessons from the Battle of the Philippine Sea about the importance of industrial capacity and technological superiority in modern warfare remain relevant in the early 21st century, even as the specific technologies and tactics have evolved beyond recognition. The fundamental principle that advanced economies with superior technology and well-trained personnel have decisive advantages in conventional warfare is still valid. The question of how to overcome such advantages when facing a more powerful opponent drives military planning and doctrine development in many nations. The historical example of Japan facing American industrial might provide both lessons and warnings that continue to inform strategic thinking about conflict between powers with different levels of technological and industrial development. The ultimate significance of the Battle of the Philippine Sea lies not in any single statistic or outcome, but in what it revealed about the nature of modern industrial warfare and the factors that determine victory when advanced nations fight each other with modern weapons and comprehensive strategies. Courage matters in war, and the Japanese pilots who flew against American forces knowing they were overmatched displayed courage that deserves acknowledgement even from their former enemies. But courage alone, divorced from adequate equipment, training and support, produces only noble deaths, not military victories. The Americans who won the battle were not necessarily braver than their opponents, but they were better equipped, better trained, better led, and better supported by industrial systems that could replace losses and sustain operations at scales their enemies couldn't match. This combination of factors produced one of the most decisive victories in naval history, a turkey shoot that demonstrated beyond any doubt that the age of industrial warfare had arrived and that nations ignoring this reality did so at their mortal peril. The sun had indeed set on Japanese naval aviation in the Philippine Sea, and the darkness that followed would only deepen until the war's end brought peace and the long work of reconstruction to both victor and vanquished.